So let's see. This really started with an email of Gerard Luber. He sent an email back in 2014 after the Birmingham conference, the ISNS Birmingham conference, with a link to the WHO paper of Wilson and Jungner. And I responded to that email with with this email. I'll manage, in the end I'll manage. Okay. So my complaint actually was to a number of people that there are no pictures of the authors, of the principles, or even resumes, or well, they're impossible to find on the internet. And I've been knowing that since 2002, because since then I was trying to lecture on the Wilson and Jungner criteria, never could find a picture. And now we have pictures for the first time. And that's because, well, almost immediately, Kate Hall and Ulrike van Deubel offered to help. And I think it's because of that we're now sitting here with Stephen and Andrew and Philip Wilson and Lars Jungner and with Maurice and Leslie, their partners, to bring Wilson and Jungner alive, in a way. And that's what we're going to do in the next coming minutes. Who were Wilson and Jungner? Why were they chosen to write this document? How did the work get its current and almost biblical reputation? And that's why I showed the picture very shortly, actually I show it again. The picture of Moses and the Ten Commandments by Ferdinand Bol, who was a contemporary of Rembrandt van Rijn. But this one was actually even more dynamic than the one that Rembrandt van Rijn has painted, because he also did one of those. And what is the current validity of the principle? So that'll be the show for the next 1 or 1.5 hours or so. So we are extremely honored to have you here, absolutely. And it's up to me to, in the next few minutes, set the stage to describe what the world was like. Why is this? What the world was like, oh, I have to do it by head, not using my notes. So what the world was like at the moment that the principles were actually conceived. What was the stage when it was conceived? And to start with that, I would like to start with Kate Hall, because her contacts in the UK led her to meet Walter Holland. And Walter Holland is a contemporary of Wilson, of Maxwell Wilson, and some of his work and even personal communication are cited in the principles. And he would have been here, but he's ill and couldn't make it, and we wish him all the best from this place. But luckily we do have a video clip, and that's what I'm going to show you now.
I think it's important to recognize the milieu about screening, which is developing in the early 60s and eventually eventuating in various publications. Very important to appreciate that the real progenitors of screening were, I suppose, well, there are lots of histories of screening, but I mean, in America it was very important. And there was an act passed, the Chronic Disease Act, by the Americans, which in fact suggested that everybody should be tested and screened. In, I think, the year that it was passed was 1957, and the Chronic Disease Commission was created as to supervise that, and a man called Lester Breslow.
He was American, wasn't he? Was he American?
Yes, he was I suppose the equivalent of the medical officer of health for California. He was the director of public health of California. He was the chair of that commission.
Okay. So that was Walter Holland. We couldn't get him any closer than this, and we're very lucky to have at least this. And what you should appreciate is that Walter Holland is now 85, and he was still working back then. He has a position at the London School of Economics, and you very specifically heard him mention the name of Dr. Lester Breslow. And Dr. Lester Breslow in the 1940s was a pioneer to investigate the health effects of smoking. And in 1952, President Truman appointed him as a director of a commission to assess the nation's health care. And he also served, you heard Walter Holland mention that, on the National Commission on Chronic Illness from 1954 to 1955. And he was the chair of the editorial committee that published the Commission's report on prevention of chronic disease. And he was a pioneer in multiphasic screening. Good heavens. There you are. On multiphasic screening, which was back then the examination of large numbers of people with a series of tests for detecting diseases. And that was already during the 1940s. And this is Dr. Maurice Cullen. Maurice Cullen was an early medical informatics expert who founded the research division at Kaiser Permanente, the US-based integrated managed care consortium funded in 1945. And Dr. Cullen put Breslow's multiphasic screening idea into practice, addressing also the physician shortage of the 1950s post-World War II. And the series of procedures and tests given to thousands of Kaiser Permanente members screened for conditions such as heart disease and diabetes and cancer, even as early as 1951. And it is really important to recognize that Maurice Cullen and Gunnar Jungner know each other and they work very well. And this is a layout of such a center with rooms for instance, auxiliary mammography, for electrocardiography, and X-rays for, of course, this is the EKG unit, a computer center, and then an automated chemical laboratory. So, in the words of Walter Holland, it's important to realize that the real progenitors of screening were the Americans, which kind of brings up the question, meanwhile, what happened on the continent? And on the continent, let's see, yeah, there was this person, Sir George Godber. He was a newly assigned medical officer, assigned in 1960, and he had a keen eye for talented colleagues and for important developments. And it was therefore that Godber sent Max Wilson on a journey to meet specialists on screening in Canada and in the United States. And that kind of marked the start of a significant knowledge transfer from the US to the UK. For instance, also illustrated by a symposium back in 1961 at Magdalen College, Oxford, with some key players of both the UK, the US, as well as Gunnar Jungner from Sweden present. So that's, in all our research, that was really the first time we put Jungner and Wilson in the same room. Must have been. There's written testimony of that. Now, having presented the key players in the era, in which the principles were conceived. Secondly, we should appreciate that also the actual monograph was inspired by early work. And obviously, well, that work was US-based as well. And one of those early progenitors of the principles was, for instance, this work, Screening for Asymptomatic Disease, Principles and Background by Morton Levin, and Journal of Chronic Disease. They had it in the US, and they didn't have it in Europe. And in this article, Levin especially reported on the results of the conference on preventive aspects of chronic disease organized by the Commission on Chronic Illness, again, March 1951. And screening and multiple screening were extensively reviewed, and one of the commissions was actually chaired by Lester Breslau. And that was a commission that tried to find criteria to be used in determining the suitability of a screening procedure for community use. That's on the next slide. So these are these criteria to be used in determining the suitability of a screening procedure. And speed readers among us may recognize primordial Wilson and Jungner-like criteria, but what I really want you to appreciate is that there were 10. Again, those biblical 10. Maybe an inspiration for later. And then this is another very early work by the US Department of Health, Education and Welfare. And they wrote a 24-page publication written by Thorner and Riemann, with a title almost identical to the principles and the work that Wilson and Jungner wrote. So this is Principles and Procedures in the Evaluation of Screening for Disease. So in summary, when setting the stage for conception of the monograph, I hope to have illustrated at least that the stage was placed in the US, and that some important decor pieces and actors were already present. And this may be a proper moment to invite Maxwell Wilson and Gunnar Jungner on stage. And I'm happy to invite Kate to do the honors. Thank you.